I am Billy, 32 years old, and I have spent most of my life feeling invisible. In our family, my younger sister Ashley was always the golden child, the genius, the one worth investing in. Today is her 25th birthday, and my parents have spared no expense for the lavish celebration at our family mansion. I arrived late, choosing a seat in the back row, watching my father announce that Ashley would inherit everything. If you're enjoying this story so far, please hit like, subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you are watching from. Trust me, you will want to see what happens when a complete stranger changes everything with a single envelope. The story of how I became the forgotten daughter began long before I fully understood what was happening. My father, James Hartman, founded Hartman Technologies in the early 90s, riding the first wave of internet companies to considerable success. My mother, Diana, was a shrewd asset manager who helped turn his technical innovations into a thriving business empire. Together, they were a power couple in our Connecticut community, respected and admired by everyone who knew them. My earliest memories are actually quite warm. As an only child for my first 7 years, I remember weekends at our lake house, my father teaching me to fish, and my mother reading bedtime stories every night without fail. I was their little princess, their entire world. When I started showing interest in drawing and painting, they proudly displayed my childish artwork on the refrigerator and in my father's home office. Those were simple, happy days that I would later look back on with a painful nostalgia. Everything changed when Ashley was born. I was 7 years old, initially excited to have a baby sister. I imagined teaching her games, sharing my toys, and having a built-in best friend. I even helped decorate her nursery painting, little stars on the wall that my parents praised as beautiful. Looking back, that was perhaps the last genuine praise I would receive from them for many years to come. The shift was not immediate, but began when Ashley was around 3 or 4 years old. She displayed an uncanny ability with numbers from an extraordinarily young age. While most children her age were learning simple counting, Ashley could already add and subtract multiple digit numbers in her head. My parents noticed and their attention gradually shifted. One particular incident stands out in my memory. When Ashley was 5, my parents hosted a dinner party for some potential investors. During dessert, my father proudly called Ashley into the dining room and asked her to solve a complex multiplication problem in front of everyone. Without hesitation, she calculated the correct answer, earning gasps and applause from the guests. I sat there, 12 years old, feeling strangely hollow as my father beamed with pride. No one seemed to notice or care about the watercolor painting I had spent all week perfecting for art class, which hung quietly in the hallway. As Ashley continued to demonstrate her mathematical prowess, my parents invested more and more of their time and resources into nurturing her gift. They hired private tutors, enrolled her in advanced math programs, and spent weekends taking her to academic competitions. Meanwhile, my own achievements in art and literature began to fade into the background. I vividly remember my 8th grade art exhibition. I had worked for months on a series of portraits that my teacher said showed remarkable talent for someone my age. The exhibition was scheduled for a Friday evening, and I had reminded my parents repeatedly in the weeks leading up to it. But when the day came, they called to say they could not make it because Ashley had a math competition in a neighboring state. They did not even sound particularly sorry about missing my moment. I stood alone beside my artwork that evening, watching other parents praise their children, take photos, and celebrate their accomplishments. My art teacher, Mrs. Daniels, noticed my isolation and stood with me for a while, telling me I had a special eye for color and composition. Her kindness almost made me cry. I comforted myself with the thought that we all have different strengths, and perhaps one day my parents would recognize mine too. But that recognition never came. Instead, the distance between how my parents treated Ashley and me only grew wider. Their attitude shifted from merely neglectful to actively comparative. Ashley was not just their favorite. She began to be positioned as inherently superior. The most painful memory from this period happened during a family dinner when I was 15 and Ashley was 8. I had received a B+ on a difficult chemistry test and was sharing my relief at passing. My father barely looked up from his plate as he said, "That is fine, Billy, but Ashley already understands the periodic table. Some people just have scientific minds and some do not." Then he turned to Ashley and said, "At least we got one smart one in the family." Everyone laughed, including Ashley, who was too young to understand the cruelty of the comment. But I understood perfectly. In that moment, I became the dumb one, a label that would follow me for years to come. The sting of my father's words followed me like a shadow. Being labeled the dumb one in a family that valued intelligence above all else was a wound that cut deep into my sense of self-worth. But somewhere beneath the hurt, a spark of defiance ignited. If I could not impress them with the kind of intelligence they valued, I would excel in areas they did not even understand. Throughout high school, I poured myself into literature and art with renewed determination. My English teachers recognized something in me that my parents never did: a gift for language and storytelling that set me apart from my peers. During my junior year, I submitted an essay to a statewide writing competition and won first place. When I brought home the certificate and a check for $500, my mother glanced at it and said, "That is nice, honey," before immediately turning the conversation to Ashley's latest achievement in her advanced mathematics program. By this point, Ashley had been placed in a specialized program for exceptionally gifted students. My parents spared no expense in supporting her education, hiring additional private tutors, sending her to academic summer camps, and even renovating the basement into a state-of-the-art study space with the latest computers and learning tools. Meanwhile, when I needed a new laptop for school, my father suggested I save up for it myself. And so I did. At 16, I got a part-time job at the local library, shelving books and helping with children's reading programs. I worked 15 hours a week while maintaining my grades and continuing to write and create art. The library became my sanctuary, a place where knowledge was democratic, accessible to anyone with curiosity. Not just those with a specific kind of intelligence my parents deemed valuable. When it came time to apply for colleges, I knew better than to expect financial support. Ashley was being groomed for the Ivy League, with my parents setting aside a substantial college fund for her education. For me, there was nothing. I applied to the state university with a solid but not spectacular arts program, knowing I would need to work my way through school. That fall, I moved into a cramped dormitory room at Connecticut State University, feeling a strange mix of freedom and abandonment. My roommate Jennifer talked excitedly about her parents helping with tuition and visiting on weekends. I smiled and nodded, not wanting to explain that my parents were too busy preparing my 14-year-old sister for a future at MIT or Harvard to concern themselves with my college experience. It was during my sophomore year that I met Professor Theodore Wilson, the first person who truly saw me. He taught American literature, and after reading my analysis of Fitzgerald's treatment of social class in The Great Gatsby, he asked me to stay after class. I braced myself for criticism, so accustomed to disapproval that I could not imagine praise. Professor Wilson, a tall man with salt and pepper hair and perpetually ink-stained fingers, looked at me over his reading glasses and said, "You have a remarkable mind, Billy. Your understanding of narrative structure and social commentary shows not just intelligence but wisdom beyond your years. I do not often say this, but you have what it takes to be a writer of significance." I nearly burst into tears right there in the classroom. For years, I had been starving for recognition, and his words were like a feast. Under Professor Wilson's mentorship, I began to develop my voice as a writer. He introduced me to authors who changed how I saw the world, guided my first attempts at short stories, and encouraged me to pursue writing not just as a hobby but as a potential career. While I was finding my path at Connecticut State, Ashley was making headlines in our family circle for being accepted to Harvard on a full scholarship. My parents threw an extravagant party to celebrate, inviting friends, family, and business associates to toast Ashley's brilliance. I received the invitation 3 days before the event, clearly an afterthought. I attended out of obligation, standing in the corner, nursing a single glass of champagne while my sister was showered with praise and expensive gifts. I graduated college with highest honors, a fact that surprised even me. The English department had selected my thesis on contemporary female writers for a special commendation, and Professor Wilson had helped me apply to several publishing internships in New York City. The graduation ceremony was scheduled for a beautiful May morning, and though I did not expect much, I had reserved 3 tickets just in case. The day before graduation, my mother called to inform me that they would not be attending. Ashley had been invited to present at a special mathematical symposium, and they could not miss such an important opportunity for her career. I said I understood, which was both the biggest lie and the most painful truth I had ever uttered. I did understand all too well exactly where I stood in the family hierarchy. The next day, as I walked across the stage to receive my diploma, I made a decision that would alter the course of my life. I would leave Connecticut behind. I would move to New York City, build a career in publishing, and create a life so far removed from my family's shadow that I would finally be able to breathe. I would become someone they could not diminish or ignore, not because I craved their approval anymore, but because I needed to prove to myself that I was worth something after all. New York City greeted me with its characteristic indifference, a refreshing change from the active dismissal I had grown accustomed to. Thanks to Professor Wilson's recommendation, I secured an entry-level editorial position at Crescent Moon Publishing, a small but respected independent press specializing in literary fiction. The pay was barely enough to cover my share of rent for a tiny 2-bedroom apartment in Brooklyn that I shared with 2 other recent graduates. But for the first time in my life, I felt like I was exactly where I belonged. My apartment might have been small with a view of nothing but brick walls and fire escapes, but it was mine. No one there compared me unfavorably to anyone else. No one measured my worth by my ability to solve equations. I decorated my corner of the living room with second-hand books and art prints, creating a space that reflected who I was rather than who I had failed to be. The work at Crescent Moon was demanding but fulfilling. I started as an editorial assistant, mainly handling slush pile submissions and administrative tasks, but my boss Natalie quickly recognized my eye for promising manuscripts. Within 6 months, I was given my own projects to develop, working directly with authors to refine their work. I loved the collaborative process, the delicate balance of preserving a writer's voice while helping them clarify their vision. During the evenings and weekends, I began working on a novel of my own. It started as a purely therapeutic exercise, a way to process the years of feeling invisible in my own family. The story followed a young woman named Eliza whose extraordinary talent for music goes unrecognized by her family, who are all celebrated mathematicians. It was fiction, but the emotional core was painfully autobiographical. Writing that manuscript was like lancing a wound, painful but ultimately healing. I wrote feverishly, sometimes staying up until 3:00 in the morning when I had to be at work by 9. The story poured out of me, years of unspoken feelings finding their way onto the page. I did not tell anyone about the project, not even my roommates. It was something private, a conversation with myself about worth and recognition. 8 months into my New York life, I attended a publishing industry mixer, one of those networking events I usually dreaded. As I stood awkwardly by the bar nursing a glass of cheap white wine, a woman in her 50s with a stylish silver bob approached me. She introduced herself as Sarah Lewis, a literary agent with Lewis and Palmer Associates. We chatted about recent book releases, and somehow I found myself telling her about my manuscript. What struck me about Sarah was how intently she listened. When I mentioned the themes of invisible talents and family dynamics, she did not offer platitudes or change the subject. Instead, she asked insightful questions that made me think more deeply about my own work. At the end of our conversation, she handed me her card and asked me to send her the first 3 chapters. 2 weeks later, Sarah called me with news that would change everything. Not only did she want to represent my novel, but she also wanted to introduce me to someone she thought I should meet. Jonathan Reed was a successful tech entrepreneur who had made his fortune developing algorithms for content discovery. He had recently turned his attention to the publishing industry, believing that technology could revolutionize how stories reached readers. Our first meeting took place at a small cafe in Chelsea. Jonathan was younger than I expected, maybe early 30s, with the intense focus common to tech visionaries. He explained that he had been developing an idea for a digital publishing platform that would use artificial intelligence to match readers with stories tailored to their interests and reading patterns. What he lacked was someone who understood literature from the inside, who could ensure that the technology served the art rather than the other way around. I do not know what Sarah told him about me, but he looked at me with none of the dismissiveness I had grown accustomed to. Instead, he spoke to me as an equal, someone whose expertise complemented his own. By the end of our 3-hour conversation, he had offered me a partnership in his venture, which would eventually become StoryEscape. The early days of StoryCape were a whirlwind of activity and anxiety. Jonathan secured a small amount of seed funding, enough for us to rent a tiny office in a coexisting workspace and hire 2 developers. I left my position at Crescent Moon, taking a massive risk on this unproven concept. For months, I lived on ramen noodles and coffee, pouring every ounce of energy into developing the content curation algorithms and editorial guidelines for the platform. My publishing background provided insights that pure tech companies missed. I understood that readers do not always know what they want until they discover it, that the joy of reading often comes from unexpected discoveries. This perspective shaped our approach to the algorithm, creating what we called guided serendipity, a system that balanced familiar preferences with carefully selected surprises. The breakthrough came when I developed a content analysis system that could identify not just genres and topics, but emotional resonance patterns in texts. Using this technology, StoryEscape could recommend books based on how they made readers feel rather than just surface-level categories. Publishers had been categorizing books this way informally for years, but we made it systematic and scalable. Our beta launch attracted attention from several angel investors, including a former publishing executive who immediately recognized the potential of our approach. With this new infusion of capital, we expanded our team and refined the platform. Throughout this period of growth, I deliberately kept StoryCape separate from my family life. In our rare phone conversations, I told my parents vaguely that I was working in digital publishing, never mentioning that I was co-founding a potentially revolutionary company. This omission was not out of spite but self-preservation. I needed to build something on my own terms without their judgment or dismissal. If StoryCape failed, I did not want to give them another reason to see me as the disappointment. And if it succeeded, I wanted that success to be purely mine, untainted by their belated approval. And succeed it did. Within 2 years of our launch, StoryEscape had over 3 million active users and had secured partnerships with 5 major publishing houses. Our series of funding round valued the company at $120 million, and by our 3rd year that valuation had climbed to over $500 million. Industry publications began calling StoryEscape the future of publishing, and my content analysis algorithm became the gold standard in the field. At 30 years old, I had quietly become a millionaire many times over. Jonathan and I were featured in technology and business magazines, though I always kept a low profile in these articles, focusing on the work rather than personal details. I moved from my shared Brooklyn apartment to a comfortable but not ostentatious condo in Manhattan. I could have afforded much more, but extravagance had never appealed to me. Financial security was enough. It meant I would never have to depend on anyone else again. Through all of this success, my contact with my family remained minimal. Holiday phone calls, occasional emails about family news. They knew I was working at some kind of publishing startup, but I never corrected their assumption that I was just an employee rather than a co-founder. My sister Ashley had graduated from Harvard with honors and taken a prestigious position at Google Fax. My parents mentioned at every opportunity. I congratulated her sincerely, holding no grudge against my sister for our parents' favoritism. I had built a life that fit me perfectly, surrounded myself with friends and colleagues who valued my mind and my contributions. I had found success on my own terms in a field that combined creativity and innovation in ways my parents could never appreciate. I was by any objective measure thriving, and yet a small part of me still wondered if I would ever be enough in their eyes. The invitation arrived on heavy cream cardstock with gold embossing, formally requesting my presence at a celebration of Ashley Hartman's 25th birthday. The party would be held at my parents' estate in Connecticut, a sprawling property I had not visited in over 3 years. My first instinct was to decline to send an expensive gift and a polite excuse, but something stopped me. Some need for closure perhaps, or simply curiosity about the family I had gradually distanced myself from. After a week of indecision, I RSVP'd yes, marking a single attendee on the response card. I spent an absurd amount of time shopping for Ashley's gift, eventually settling on a Cartier watch that I knew she would appreciate. The price tag would have been unthinkable to me a few years ago, but now represented only a tiny fraction of my net worth. I wrapped it carefully in silver paper with a simple card expressing birthday wishes. The drive from New York to Connecticut took just under 2 hours, giving me ample time to cycle through a range of emotions. Anxiety, resentment, a strange sense of nostalgia, and underneath it all, a quiet confidence that had not existed the last time I had driven up this familiar road. I was no longer the overlooked daughter desperate for approval. I was Billy Hartman, co-founder of Storyscape, a woman who had created something meaningful in the world. I arrived at the estate as the celebration was already in full swing. Luxury cars lined the circular driveway, and I could hear music and conversation spilling from the open doors of the house. I parked my modest Volvo between a Bentley and a Mercedes, suddenly self-conscious about my deliberate choice to live below my means. For a moment I considered leaving before anyone saw me, but I took a deep breath and stepped out of the car, smoothing the wrinkles from my simple black dress. The party was even more lavish than I had anticipated. The grand ballroom of my childhood home had been transformed into something out of a fairy tale, with cascading flowers, champagne fountains, and what appeared to be half of Connecticut's elite in attendance. I recognized tech executives, financial magnates, and several of my father's business partners mingling among the guests. I chose a seat at the back of the room, placing Ashley's gift on the designated table before finding a quiet corner from which to observe. My mother spotted me first, offering a brief nod of acknowledgement before returning to her conversation with the wife of a venture capitalist. My father did not notice me at all, too busy introducing Ashley to important connections. She looked beautiful and confident in a designer gown, laughing at something one of my father's associates said. For the first hour I nursed a single glass of champagne, watching the dynamics I had grown up with play out from a new perspective. My parents still orbited around Ashley like planets around a sun, presenting her to influential guests with barely concealed pride. A few family friends stopped by to say hello to me, expressing surprise at seeing me after so long. Their conversations inevitably turned to questions about my job, which I answered vaguely, saying only that I worked for a digital publishing company in New York. As the evening progressed, my father called for everyone's attention, tapping his crystal glass with a silver spoon. The room quieted as he moved to the center, Ashley at his side, my mother beaming nearby. I straightened in my chair, preparing myself for whatever was coming. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for coming to celebrate our beautiful daughter Ashley's 25th birthday. My father began, his voice carrying the practiced authority of a successful businessman. As many of you know, Ashley has always been exceptional. From solving complex equations as a child to graduating summa cum laude from Harvard, she has consistently proven herself to be brilliant beyond measure. The crowd murmured appreciatively, many nodding in agreement. I took another sip of champagne, nodding how my father had not acknowledged my presence or even mentioned he had another daughter. After Harvard, Ashley joined Google's advanced technology division, where she has already filed 2 patents. My father continued proudly. Her analytical mind and innovative thinking have always made her mother and me incredibly proud. And today, on her 25th birthday, we want to announce something special that recognizes her extraordinary capabilities. My father paused for dramatic effect, his arm around Ashley's shoulders. What came next sent a shockwave through me despite years of preparation for exactly this kind of dismissal. Today we are officially naming Ashley as the sole heir to Hartman Technologies and all associated family assets. My father announced this includes full ownership of our company currently valued at $33 million. Our New York property valued at $10 million, and as a special birthday gift, the keys to a brand new Tesla Model S. Gasps and applause filled the room. Ashley covered her mouth in what appeared to be surprise, though the lack of genuine shock in her eyes told me she had known about this announcement in advance. My mother stepped forward with a small velvet box, presumably containing the keys to the Tesla, and cameras flashed as Ashley accepted it with a show of humility. My father was not finished. While we have always believed in treating our children fairly, he continued business decisions must be made with the company's best interests in mind. Billy, his eyes finally finding me in the back of the room, has many talents, but she does not have the head for business that Hartman Technologies requires for its future leadership. We are confident that Ashley will guide our company to new heights in the coming decades. The room seemed to spin around me as every guest turned to locate the daughter who had just been publicly deemed unworthy. I sat perfectly still, my expression carefully neutral despite the familiar pain blooming in my chest. Nothing had changed. After all these years, all my accomplishments, I was still the disappointment, the afterthought, the daughter without the right kind of mind. What my father did not know, what none of them knew, was that the digital publishing startup they dismissed so casually had revolutionized an entire industry. That the daughter without a head for business had built a company valued higher than Hartman Technologies. That while they were planning this public humiliation, I had been negotiating a potential acquisition offer that would make me one of the wealthiest women in the publishing world. As the applause died down and the party resumed, I sat in my corner contemplating a quiet exit. I had seen enough confirmed what I had always known about my place in this family. There was no reason to stay for cake and further dismissal. I gathered my purse and stood up, preparing to slip out unnoticed when a hand on my arm stopped me. Miss Hartman, Billy Hartman. The voice belonged to a man I did not recognize, perhaps in his early 60s with silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He was impeccably dressed in a tailored suit that spoke of quiet wealth rather than flashy status. Yes, I replied, wondering if he was one of my father's business associates I should have recognized. The man smiled warmly. Forgive the intrusion. My name is Richard Maxwell. I am a financial advisor and longtime observer of the business world. I have been hoping to meet you for some time. His manner was so genuinely courteous that I found myself relaxing slightly, though still confused by the encounter. Have we crossed paths before, Mr. Maxwell? Not directly, he said, but I have followed your career with great interest. He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a sealed envelope. I believe this belongs in your hands, particularly after what just transpired. I accepted the envelope with confusion, noting its weight and professional appearance. Before I could ask any further questions, Richard leaned closer and said in a low voice, "It is time to tell them who you really are." My fingers trembled slightly as I opened the envelope, unsure what to expect. Inside was a professional valuation report for Story SA prepared by one of the most respected financial firms in New York. The current valuation $650 million with projected growth that would likely push us into unicorn status, a $1 billion company within the next year. Behind this document was a printout of an article scheduled to appear in the Wall Street Journal the following week, profiling me as one of the most promising publishing technology entrepreneurs of the decade. The headline read, "How Billy Hartman is Revolutionizing the Way We Discover and Consume Literature." I looked up at Richard, speechless. "How did you get this? The valuation was confidential and the article has not even been published yet." Richard smiled. "I have connections in various industries, but that is not important. What matters is that while your family has been dismissing your capabilities, you have been quietly building something extraordinary, something that dwarfs Hartman Technologies in both innovation and value." I remained suspicious. "Why would you show me this? Why now?" "I knew your professor Theodore Wilson," Richard explained. "We were colleagues many years ago at Yale. He told me about a brilliant young woman with extraordinary insight into narrative structure and human psychology. He said you would change publishing if given the chance. When I began seeing the name Billy Hartman associated with Storycape, I made the connection." "Theodore told you about me?" I asked, remembering my mentor with a sudden wave of gratitude. "He did. He said you were the most talented student he had ever taught, but that you had been conditioned not to recognize your own brilliance. I have been watching your company grow from afar, impressed by your innovative approach and strategic decisions. The content analysis algorithm you developed is nothing short of revolutionary." I absorbed this information slowly, still processing the strange turn the evening had taken. "So you came here tonight to what? Reveal my secret success?" Richard's expression grew more serious. "I came because I read about this party in the society pages and suspected, given what Theodore had told me about your family dynamics, that something like this might happen." He gestured toward the front of the room where my parents and Ashley were still surrounded by well-wishers. "Sometimes the greatest healing comes not from hiding our light, but from allowing it to shine, especially in places where it has previously been dimmed." I stared at the documents in my hands, years of silence and acceptance battling with a sudden urge to stand up and speak my truth. "What would you do?" I asked, surprising myself with the question. Richard considered for a moment. That is not for me to say, but I will offer this wounds healed differently in darkness than they do in light. Sometimes we keep secrets to protect ourselves, and sometimes those very secrets become the walls of our own prisons. His words resonated with something deep inside me. For years I had protected myself by keeping my success separate from my family. I had told myself it was about independence, about proving something to myself rather than to them. But standing there holding physical proof of my accomplishments, while the echo of my father's dismissal still hung in the air, I wondered if silence had become its own kind of surrender. The truth is, Richard continued gently, you did not need their approval to succeed. You have proven that beyond any doubt. The question now is whether you need their recognition to heal. I looked across the room at my family, truly seeing them perhaps for the first time. My father proud and certain of his judgments. My mother elegant and accommodating. Ashley brilliant but perhaps also trapped in the narrow role they had assigned her. I had been defined by their perception for so long. Perhaps it was time to redefine the narrative. But would revealing the truth be an act of healing or revenge? I did not want to hurt them or humiliate Ashley on her birthday. I had never resented my sister for being the favorite. She had not created the dynamic that had caused me so much pain. Richard seemed to read my thoughts. This is not about putting them in their place, Billy. It is about claiming yours. There is a profound difference. As I stood there contemplating my next move, Ashley caught my eye from across the room. For a brief moment, something passed between us. A flicker of recognition, perhaps even regret. She had always known about the favoritism but had been too young, too dependent on our parents' approval to challenge it. We were both victims of our parents' narrow vision in different ways. I took a deep breath, feeling a strange calm settle over me. Thank you for this, I said to Richard, carefully folding the documents and returning them to the envelope. Whether I was ready to use this information or not, having it felt like reclaiming a piece of myself that had been surrendered long ago. Richard nodded, understanding in his eyes. Whatever you decide, remember that your worth was never determined by their ability to see it. It has always been there waiting for you to claim it. With that, he stepped back, allowing me space to make my decision. The party continued around us, glasses clinking, laughter rising and falling, my family still at the center of it all. I stood at the periphery as I always had, but something fundamental had shifted. For the first time in that house, I felt solid ground beneath my feet, unshakable even in the face of lifelong dismissal. The question was no longer whether I was enough. The question was whether I was ready to step out of the shadows I had been assigned to and into the light I had created for myself. Not for their validation, but for my own liberation. I watched my parents and Ashley posing for photographs, surrounded by admirers congratulating them on the big announcement. My heart hammered against my ribs, but my mind was suddenly remarkably clear. Years of therapy could not have prepared me for this moment. Yet I felt ready in a way I could not have imagined when I first arrived at the party. I slipped the envelope into my purse and made my way toward the center of the room. Each step felt deliberate, as if I were walking not just across a floor but across a threshold between my old self and someone new. Guests parted before me, some recognizing me as the daughter who had just been publicly sidelined, curiosity in their eyes. I reached the small circle surrounding my family, just as the photographer was suggesting one more picture. Excuse me, I said, my voice surprisingly steady. I would like to say a few words if I may. The surprise on my father's face was evident. He had clearly expected me to leave quietly after his announcement, as I had done so many times before when faced with disappointment. My mother's expression flickered between confusion and concern, while Ashley looked genuinely curious. Of course, my father recovered quickly, gesturing magnanimously. Ladies and gentlemen, my other daughter Billy would like to speak. The room quieted, all eyes turning to me. I took a deep breath, conscious that what I was about to do would permanently alter my relationship with my family. But some truths need to be spoken not out of vengeance but as an act of self-relimation. Thank you. I began looking around at the assembled guests. First, I would like to wish my sister a very happy birthday. Ashley, I have always admired your brilliance and dedication. I smiled at her and meant it. The favoritism had never been her fault. Then I turned to my parents. Mom, Dad, I want to thank you as well. Not for what you might expect, but for something much more valuable than inheritance or assets. I want to thank you for teaching me self-reliance, for showing me that I needed to find my own path, build my own success, and define my own worth. Confusion spread across my father's face. He had expected tears perhaps, or resigned acceptance, but not this calm dignity. You mentioned earlier that I do not have a head for business. I continued that Hartman Technologies requires a specific kind of mind, one that I apparently do not possess. I found that particularly interesting because for the past 5 years I have been building and running my own company. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. My mother's eyes widened, and for the first time that evening my father looked directly at me, really seeing me. Many of you have probably heard of StoryEscape, I said, addressing the room at large. We are a digital publishing platform that uses proprietary algorithms to connect readers with literature tailored to their preferences and emotional resonance patterns. What you might not know is that I am not just an employee there. I am the co-founder and chief content officer, the developer of the core algorithm that has revolutionized how people discover books. The room had gone completely silent. I could see several guests discreetly pulling out their phones, presumably to look up StoryCape and verify my claims. StoryCape was recently valued at $650 million. I continued, my voice steady. We are currently in talks with major technology companies about a potential acquisition that would value us even higher. The Wall Street Journal will be running a profile on me next week as one of the most innovative entrepreneurs in publishing technology. I turned to Richard, who stood at the edge of the crowd, a small smile on his face. He nodded encouragingly. I am not sharing this to boast or to diminish Ashley's accomplishments, which are substantial and well-deserved. I am sharing it because for too long I allowed your assessment of my capabilities to define me. I accepted the role of the less talented daughter, the one without the right kind of intelligence to matter in your world. My father had gone pale, my mother's hand covering her mouth in shock. Ashley stared at me with wide eyes and unreadable expression on her face. The truth is, I built something meaningful, something that has transformed an entire industry without your support or recognition. I did it quietly, not because I was ashamed, but because I needed to know that I could succeed on my own terms by my own definition of success. I pulled out my phone and pulled up the StoryCape website, handing it to a nearby guest who happened to be a well-known tech investor. He glanced at the screen, then looked at me with new respect. It is true, he confirmed to the room. StorySape is one of the most innovative platforms in digital publishing. We tried to get in on their last funding round, but they were already oversubscribed. The validation sent another ripple through the crowd. I could see the realization dawning on my parents' faces as they began to understand the magnitude of what I was revealing. I want to be clear about something, I said, looking directly at my father. I do not want or need to inherit Hartman Technologies. I do not need the New York property or the Tesla. I have built something of my own, something that reflects who I am and what I value. I am not here to claim what you never thought I deserved. I'm here to reclaim the narrative about who I am and what I am capable of. The silence in the room was absolute. Then, to my surprise, Ashley stepped forward and threw her arms around me in a tight embrace. I am so sorry, she whispered in my ear, tears in her eyes. I always knew how unfair it was, but I never had the courage to say anything. I am so proud of you, Billy. Her sincerity broke something open inside me, a tenderness I had protected for years. I hugged her back, realizing that we had both been shaped by our parents' limited vision in different but equally confining ways. When we separated, my mother had tears streaming down her face. She moved toward me hesitantly, as if unsure of her welcome. Billy, I had no idea. Why did you never tell us? Because you never asked, I said simply. You decided who I was a long time ago and never bothered to look again. My father remained frozen, his worldview visibly crumbling around him. The daughter he had dismissed had built something larger than his life's work without his help or guidance. I could see him struggling to reconcile this new reality with the narrative he had constructed and believed for decades. I did not come here looking for apologies or to disrupt Ashley's celebration, I said, softening my tone. I came because, despite everything, you are my family. But I will not accept being defined by your limitations anymore. I am more than the box you put me in. I always have been. With those words, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders, years of seeking approval and acceptance falling away. I had said my truth not in anger but in simple, undeniable fact. I had shown them who I really was, not through argument or defensiveness, but through achievement they could not dismiss or minimize. I gave Ashley a final squeeze of the hand, nodded to my stunned parents, and turned to leave. As I walked toward the door, heads turned to follow my progress. I was no longer invisible. I was no longer the forgotten daughter. I was Billy Hartman, exactly as I had made myself to be. Richard caught my eye as I passed him, a look of respect and something like pride on his face. In that moment, I understood that sometimes the greatest act of healing is not forgiveness or reconciliation, but simply standing in your own truth and letting it speak for itself. The cool evening air greeted me as I stepped outside, breathing deeply as if tasting freedom for the first time. Whatever happened next with my family, I had broken the spell that had held me captive for so long. I had finally truly come into my own. 6 months can change everything or nothing at all, depending on how you measure change. In the half year following Ashley's birthday party, my external circumstances remained largely the same. StoryCape continued its upward trajectory. The Wall Street Journal profile led to features in Forbes and Fast Company, and our acquisition talks progressed, though we ultimately decided to remain independent for another growth cycle. But beneath these professional constants, seismic shifts were taking place in my personal landscape. The most immediate change came from an unexpected source: my sister Ashley. 2 days after the party, she showed up at my Manhattan condo unannounced, carrying 2 cups of coffee and an expression of determination. I should have known, she said when I opened the door. All those stories you used to write when we were kids, the way you could explain complex ideas so clearly, I just never questioned what Mom and Dad told us about who was smart and who was not. Over those coffees, Ashley and I had our first real conversation as adults. She confessed that she had always felt trapped by our parents' expectations, afraid to explore interests beyond mathematics and science for fear of disappointing them. The perfect daughter role had been its own kind of prison. I never wanted the company, she admitted. I wanted to teach mathematics to children, develop new ways of making numbers accessible and exciting, but I never had the courage to tell them that. By the end of that visit, something new had formed between us, a bridge across years of manufactured distance. We were not just sisters by blood, but potentially by choice as well. 2 women reclaiming our narratives from those who had written them for us. My parents' response took longer to materialize. 3 weeks of silence followed the party, then a carefully worded email from my mother, asking if I would be willing to meet them for lunch. I agreed, suggesting a neutral restaurant in Manhattan rather than either of our territories. That lunch was one of the most difficult experiences of my life. We sat across from each other like strangers navigating unfamiliar terrain without the comfortable scripts that had defined our interactions for decades. My father, a man unaccustomed to being wrong, struggled visibly with his new understanding of the daughter he had dismissed. "We had no idea," my mother said at one point, tears threatening. "We thought you were happy with your little publishing job." "I was never unhappy with my career choice," I explained. "I love publishing. What made me unhappy was being defined solely by what I was not rather than what I was." My father cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with the emotional tenor of the conversation. "What you have built is impressive, Billy. I should have seen your potential earlier." It was not an apology. Not exactly, but it was perhaps as close as he could come at that stage. I accepted it for what it was, a first tentative step toward recognition. Over the following months, our relationship began a slow, awkward process of reconstruction. My parents made efforts I would never have expected, reading articles about Storycape, asking questions about our business model, even attending a digital publishing conference where I was a keynote speaker. They sat in the front row, and for the first time in my life, I saw genuine pride in their eyes when they looked at me. Ashley and I developed a new kind of sisterhood. She finally told our parents about her desire to leave Google and pursue educational mathematics. And to their credit, they supported her decision. We began to collaborate on a series of children's books that combined her mathematical expertise with my storytelling ability, creating something neither of us could have accomplished alone. Perhaps the most profound change, however, was internal. The need for parental approval that had driven so much of my life gradually loosened its grip on my heart. I had proven myself not just to them but to myself, and in doing so had discovered that external validation was far less important than I had believed. 3 months after the party, I established the Narrative Potential Foundation, a nonprofit organization providing scholarships and mentorship to young writers and artists from underserved communities. The foundation focused particularly on students whose talents might be overlooked in traditional educational settings, those with creative rather than analytical minds. Each scholarship recipient was paired with a professional mentor in their field, ensuring they received the recognition and guidance I had found so late in my own journey. Richard Maxwell became a trusted advisor and friend. Over dinner one evening, I finally asked him why he had chosen to intervene so dramatically at Ashley's party. "Because talent deserves witness," he said simply. "Theodore believed in you when no one else did. I merely continued what he started." The healing process was neither linear nor complete. There were still awkward family dinners, moments when old patterns threatened to reassert themselves, days when I questioned whether true reconciliation was possible. But each time I found myself slipping into doubt, I remembered the moment I had stood in my truth, neither apologizing for it, nor weaponizing it against those who had failed to see it. The real lesson I came to understand was not about success or recognition or even family dynamics. It was about the stories we allow others to tell about us and our power to rewrite them. For years, I had lived within the confines of my parents' narrative, accepting their assessment of my capabilities and worth. The true transformation had come not when I proved them wrong, but when I stopped needing to prove anything at all. Success was never about building $1 million company or seeing my name in business magazines. It was about creating something authentic, something that reflected my unique perspective and abilities. The external achievements were merely evidence of what had always been true, that worth is inherent, not assigned, and that the most profound validation comes from within. If my story resonates with you, perhaps you too have lived within someone else's definition of your potential. Perhaps you have accepted limitations that were never yours to begin with. If so, I hope you find the courage to reclaim your narrative, to step into the fullness of who you are rather than the narrow slice others have deemed acceptable or valuable. The envelope that changed everything sits framed on my office wall now, not as a reminder of vindication, but as a symbol of liberation. Sometimes the greatest gift we can receive is the courage to be seen not as others imagine us but as we truly are. What about you? Have you ever felt underestimated or placed in a box that did not fit who you really are? How did you break free from others' expectations? Share your story in the comments below and remember to like, subscribe, and share this video if it resonated with you. Every one of us has a unique gift to offer the world, often in ways those closest to us fail to recognize. Thank you for listening to my journey, and may you find the courage to fully embrace yours. Music.